Hello, everyone. We're excited to have you here with us today as we chat how to bring control to hybrid AD and Office 365 with identity governance and administration. I'm Justin. I work alongside the Microsoft experts here at Chaosoft and just need to quickly run us through some housekeeping before we jump in. So first off, your microphones are muted, but please don't let that stop you from asking questions today. Now, depending on how you joined, whether in browser or through an app, you're going to see a question and or chat section. Drop your questions in there and we will keep an eye on that. If we happen to not cover your question, we will follow up with you individually after the event. I'd also like to point out that we do have a few data sheets and other supporting assets in the handout section for this event, which you can find in this meeting interface. So feel free to check those out, download, and share with your team. Also, the session will be recorded and we'll email you a link to that in the days following. I want to go ahead and mention, if you're still looking at this first slide, you'll see a picture of Bob Boble. I'd like to introduce him while his picture is still up. So Bob is actually the co-founder of Chaosoft and is one of the leading experts in hybrid Active Directory management and recovery. He has more than 25 years in the Microsoft identity industry, so he's very qualified and well-versed in this arena. But before I pass it over to Bob, we'll head over to the next slide. And if everyone could take a quick moment to follow us on social media. This is our last slide before we jump in, by the way. You'll see on the screen here a QR code for each of your favorite social networks. So you can conveniently just use your phone cameras to scan the little box below, and it will take you directly to our social page. So while you're doing that, lastly, I want to quickly mention that at the end of the presentation, we'll be randomly drawing one winner of a $100 Amazon gift card. So make sure you stay on the line until then as we draw from the list of those present at that time. Alrighty, now that that is out of the way, I'll pass it over to our speaker. Welcome, Bob.
Hey, thanks, Justin. I really appreciate it. I'm going to give everybody a couple of more seconds. If you're old like I am, I had a real hard time the first time I did this. Those little boxes across the bottom, they're called QR codes. That QR code, if you just simply take your Apple or your Android or whatever fancy phone you have, your smartphone, open the camera and just sort of aim it at one of the boxes, it'll bring up a URL. You can tap it. It'll take you right to the page where you'll find a button to follow Chaosoft on that particular platform. And the reason I mention that is because oftentimes, because we are working with a lot of different customers, we will find things or see things happening in the Microsoft cloud or on-premise that you may not find out for weeks or months, or maybe in some cases ever. And we will announce things on those social platforms. So if you get a chance, go ahead and grab that, follow us, and hopefully we'll provide some good information for you over the next time you're a follower. So today's agenda is pretty simple. This particular presentation is designed to go through the basics of a term that's being used pretty widely in the industry called identity governance and administration. If you boil that up, it's really about securing your user accounts and securing the assets that those user accounts or the entitlements those user accounts are granted access to. So in the top right, we kind of have a little extra box up there that says identity security. But when you see identity governance and administration, think identity security. That's the ultimate goal here, is to secure not just the identities themselves, but the management processes around them. So we're going to start off really easily with what is identity governance and administration. I'll lend some maybe clarification to those terms as we go through that definition. We'll talk about why IGA is needed for hybrid Active Directory and Office 365. And when we say hybrid AD or hybrid Active Directory, that could be hybrid on-premise Active Directory or it could be hybrid Azure Active Directory. Either one, both need IGA in the worst way, in a usable interface, usable component, and as well as Office 365, whether you're in hybrid mode or not. It is definitely something that's needed. Those things that IGA provide have immediate and lasting benefit for both Active Directory in normal standalone mode, hybrid mode, Azure AD in standalone mode, or any of those combined with Office 365. Then we'll talk a little bit about a couple of policies that are usually the most commonly found within organizations, and they're commonly found because they have great cost savings and they bring tremendous security benefits. And we'll talk about those top IGA initiatives or policies that we see all of our customers moving towards, or other customers that we're working with, maybe on our identity resilience product. And then we'll talk about how IGA meets ITDR. And like we needed another acronym. IGA, Identity Governance and Access, and Administration, is supported and enhanced by Identity Threat Detection and Response, ITDR. And we'll go through what the heck is ITDR, where'd the term come from, and how does it help IGA. And I think it'll be a pretty interesting point that we're going to make. And I'm not sure many people are talking about that yet. So let's start off and define IGA itself. Really, it's a set of policies and procedures, or software, if you want to call it software instead of procedures, that standardize the way identity management is performed within your organization. It also helps to provide controls that will enforce those procedures or policies that you've decided upon. The idea is, without some enforcement or set of standards, you cannot predictably perform identity and access management tasks. They all become one-off admin tasks. Now, you won't be able to automate everything. There is going to be, or set policies and standards for everything. There will always be some bit of manual effort that either was too expensive to program around in your identity management system, or it's like it happens once every 500 years, right? Or every 10 years or 50 months or whatever. And so there will always be some tweaking that has to go on that is going to be set up to do manual management of identities and access. And in some environments, it'll always be manual. There will be no automation to it, and the policies will become those manual set of steps. In other cases, the policies will become workflows or procedures that are automated to remove the human element, which is just one more place where things can go awry and you can get an unpredictable result. IGA policies are typically implemented as a series of, and this is a very important word, demonstratable IT controls. So your IT team, you may have heard that you do have an identity management platform. Oracle has a very popular one. Microsoft just killed theirs, unfortunately, the end-of-life identity manager. And there are others out there. And those are typically really big, complex, cumbersome systems, designed to do high volume, but they are, specifically designed for the way your company has its processes laid out. And those are perfectly fine. They work. They typically are connected to HR and they provision. But there are a lot of things that go beyond just that basic identity platform that you may want to have access to, not just because you want to have these policies and procedures enforced, but because those identity platforms, they typically will do, a lot of things very lightly and nothing very deeply. Like, I don't know of any of those that assigns Office 365 licenses, for example. It's a very standard thing to do nowadays, and none of the ones that I know of, unless you program it, which can be pretty costly, will perform those simple tasks, just because they're just happy to get the user account created across 6 different systems or whatever it might be. They don't drill down deeply on any particular one. And so those controls are important. You can also typically implement IGA controls on top of whatever identity system you already have. In fact, Microsoft has some starts to an identity management platform with Azure and hybrid AD, but they just don't deliver everything that you're going to need to ensure those standards. And and efficiencies. So once you get a set of IT controls in around IGA, and things are predictable, repeatable, they become very efficient because it's the same process over and over and over again, and people understand it. It's accurate. If there is something wrong with the procedure, you change the procedure to improve it, right? So it's very iterative. But it also gives you a point at which you can start to do more and more automation. And this is typically the point where you start to look for solutions, like ours, that not only provide IGA capability, but then have the automation capability as well. And again, you don't need programming platforms to do this. It's just in this modern day and age, you just don't need to code stuff. You don't even have to write SQL statements. I mean, that's, I've seen some platforms that, hey, there's no code. Well, no, they make you write these, 10-foot long SQL where clauses. You don't need to do that stuff. There's a lot better ways of doing things. So what are some of those example policies? Well, here are 7 example policies. Yeah, do you have a question?
Hey, Bob, we have our first question. Are IGA solutions only available on premises?
No, absolutely not. No. So any good IGA product that's helping you implement these policies should work just as well on premise as it does with the cloud. And in fact, it should work with both of them simultaneously, which we all know is hybrid mode. But I would not look or consider a vendor that isn't natively out of the box already working in hybrid mode with their products. I would also be very careful. Some folks will claim to have hybrid solutions. In reality, what they're doing is they have 2 or 3 things they might make you buy, and then they try to use the Frankenstein method to create a solution. They have, here's our cloud solution, and you have to load this to create a common dashboard with this on-premise product, and it's a mess. Just be careful that you get a solution that works out of the box in hybrid mode, or just on-premise or in cloud only, so that you don't have to spend oodles of time messing with some bolted on or bolted together last minute configuration that somebody put together to try and solve a marketing problem. Good question. Thanks for that. Appreciate it. So back to our examples. Here are 7 examples, and there can be more. This is just the ones that are the most likely to be seen. User account provisioning. Automating that is one of the best things you can do, assuming you have good HR data. Big assumption. Some companies will hire people, they show up to work, and then their paperwork is submitted, and then HR. So they'll be working for the company for a week before HR knows that they're there. Hopefully within the pay period, they get the paperwork done, HR knows they're there, and they eventually get paid. But if you're in the situation where you have an HR system, the data is fairly accurate, and that it's kept up to date, why not grab that data and do new hires, onboardings, and offboardings using that data? Any good IGA system will provide automation to do that. Request access, that's a very common element. There may be, somebody needs access to a spreadsheet on the network or some application. Being able to ask the owner or the person responsible for that, can I have access? And this is, why, and here's the type of access I want. And then having them turn around and approve it through a workflow system is much more efficient than passing emails around or submitting paper forms. So obviously IGA then brings automation just simply because you don't have all that paperwork to shuffle around. Access certification, this is an interesting one. A lot of people don't talk about or hear about. An access certification is just, let's review the access that this particular person has, or let's review who has access to a particular resource. And when you go through an access certification, the owner, the person who has the business knowledge why somebody should or should not be granted access to a particular resource, that person reviews everybody that has access to make sure that they're the right people that should have access to those resources. If they're not, they can correct the problem and submit their certification. If they are the correct people, they just leave the list as it is and they go on. So it's a very, a granular way of looking to make sure only the right people have access to the right resources. Temporal access grants. Here's another interesting one. I have somebody that needs access to a project folder for a week, and I don't want to have to remember to go revoke that permission later on. So good IGA systems have the ability to have a start access time and an end access time. Or maybe just a fixed duration, like you can have access, we'll grant it to you. Whenever you start, you have 24 hours and then it's revoked. Those types of things, very, very powerful features. Privileged identity management. What's a privileged identity? First of all, a privileged identity is a user account, an identity that has permissions to perform administrative tasks or access specific things. It's typically used to describe the people that are working on your network, resetting passwords, adding people's access, revoking access, the people doing the manual work. Those folks have extra privileges or permissions in your environment, and so they can be dangerous if somebody were to compromise their account. And so these IGA systems have oftentimes an administrative component for role-based administration that enforces some key principles around privileged identities. For example, temporal access is a good example. Hey, that's a really powerful account that person has. So let's only give it that power to, let's say, delete accounts for an hour or 6 hours, and then it'll automatically be revoked. Or let's ensure that the person who can create new user accounts, that they log in only between certain hours or whatever it might be. But you want to have those restrictions around those really powerful accounts because they're often a target of an attack. Entitlements management, another great one. These are typically wrapped around the use of groups to assign resource accesses. In the Microsoft world, groups are how you do things. You put people in a group, the group is granted some permission on a folder or a SharePoint site or a shared mailbox or what have you, and anybody else put in the group gets that same permission to perform those tasks. So you want some system that understands the entitlement. An entitlement, by the way, is something that a user is granted because they deserve it based on their job or based on the business logic that the owner of the data uses to grant or deny access to people. They just call them entitlements. And then finally, any IGA solution worth its salt should allow, in a lot of these areas, not just sort of running a script, should allow these administrative tasks, these IGA type tasks to be automated. So for example, the entitlements management, maybe everybody who is in the New York office and they have a department name of finance, they automatically get access to the newsletter for the New York office. Those types of things should just be built into the process. And again, these are some interesting examples of identity management policies that IGA can cover. Now, when I look at all of these are sort of individual things that can be done. So we don't usually call user account provisioning. We call it user account lifecycle or access lifecycle. So in a moment, you're going to see some top policies, and you'll see the naming is just a little bit different, just because they're a little bit broader. So what's up with IGA? Why do we need it? So the why we need IGA, especially around hybrid Active Directory and Office 365, is in the popularity of the Microsoft platform. We did a study with Gartner where they went out and surveyed several hundred individuals and came back with some details around what their identity management framework was. Now, these were people that were using Active Directory for their storage of their identities, their user accounts. And they wanted to know, are you on-premise only? Are you in the cloud already, or are you in between? And so when they did this survey, they found that 79% were in what's called hybrid mode. And that meant their identities on-premise were linked and synced to a equivalent identity in the cloud. And so that meant that 79% of the organizations, and I would argue that this probably is worldwide. I think this is a pretty universal survey, but 79% of organizations entrust the access for their employees to all on-premise resources and to cloud resources to hybrid Active Directory. And so that means that there's a heavy reliance on that system to run their businesses or run their organizations. And what was interesting is more than half said they had no intention of going beyond hybrid. They weren't looking to move to cloud only. They were staying in hybrid mode on premise and cloud because of the benefits it provided. Now there were a group, about 25%, that said, hey, someday we might be in cloud. And we do hear that. We don't see a lot of people doing it, but we do hear about it. There's some problems with hybrid in that the on-premise Active Directory is an older architecture. It has a lot of settings that can be missed. We call that being porous. Lots of things that can be configured incorrectly or just not configured in the first place that would leave openings for people that might want to cause problems. You do connect that with this free tool called Azure AD Connect to the cloud Azure Active Directory, and it just does a basic synchronization. But I think the thing that you want to keep in mind is that that on-premise directory was never really designed to be exposed to the internet. And it's very, very popular. Something like 90% of organizations globally, I think is from Microsoft, are using Active Directory. And 79% of those folks are the ones that are hybrid mode. But because it's popular and it was never meant to connect to the internet, it is now one of the prime targets for people, doing bad deeds. So we wanted to judge the importance of Active Directory and what impact it would have if there was an Active Directory outage. And so we gave them a list of 5 things and said, which of the, what are the 3, and in order, what 3 of the 5 are most important to you as somebody who is responsible for Active Directory at your organization? And the number one answer that came back was that if they lost Active Directory or they had an outage, the entire organization would cease. That's how reliant people are on Active Directory. And so it's very critical that you implement IGA, and I would argue ITDR, to make sure that the directory doesn't have an outage. After ceasing to operate, which I'm not sure why you'd go beyond that, it was loss of money, and then the third one was loss of data, and then fourth was, hey, we might be embarrassed, loss of brand, and then finally they might lose intellectual property. But the number one item was definitely the operation or their organization would just stop working because nobody could access their mail or all those things that in a modern business that we expect to be able to get to. Because a lot of people recognize the importance of Active Directory and that taking it out, whether that's permanently or temporarily, has a big impact on the organization. It is a prime target for what's known as ransomware. And the thought on the bad guys' part is, hey, if their entire business goes offline, what if I attack them and take it out and then demand money to bring it back? That's ransomware in a nutshell. And there are other variants of malware, wiperware and others that do damage to Active Directory or advanced persistent threat software that targets Active Directory, where they end up lurking in the directory and kind of watching, could be for a year or 2 years before they do anything, and maybe it's just to steal some information. But cyber attacks, especially ransomware attacks, have become continuous, and it's definitely a cyber war going on. And so we've listed out a couple in January. Actually, I think it was May, when Russia attacked Ukraine. One of the very first attack points was wiperware attacks take out Active Directory. We've also seen recently Lincoln College go out of business after 130 some plus years of being a college because they got hit with a ransomware attack they didn't have backups and they didn't have the money to move forward with the ransom. IGA for compliance. Okay, well, it's important to understand that these controls are not just sort of a thought exercise. There are actually a lot of, in addition to just standardizing and maybe some automation, there may be some real world application for these things as well in terms of satisfying hard requirements. And so if your organization is publicly held, it's a financial organization, you deal with healthcare, if you accept credit cards, you might be subject to one of the legal or regulatory compliance requirements we have listed here. And by the way, this is a short list. There are a lot of other ones, much to people's disappointment, but it keeps the various organizations or business areas sort of honest or functioning. These are standards for the business practices rather than the IT practices. But IGA as a set of IGA controls is implemented as a set of controls can be used to sustain your compliance requirements, which is fantastic. Looks like we have another question too. And so oftentimes what you'll hear with people talking and worried about compliance is they want to avoid a material finding. Oh, what is a material finding? Well, a material finding is that you don't have some control in place that will prevent a violation of compliance. And again, an IGA solution oftentimes will solve that. And I can give you an example. Let's say, for example, you have a person in finance that has unannounced financial results for a publicly held company. You don't want necessarily everybody in the business to be able to access that because they're secret until it's publicly announced. And those unannounced financial results, should they leak to the market, could change the stock price, which has a material impact on the financial performance of the business. And so part of Sarbanes-Oxley is that people shouldn't have access to things that they don't need. And that would fall under that internal controls for management assets. You don't want that stuff being disseminated uncontrollably. And so an IGA solution might put in their self-service group management and allowing the CFO to decide who should have access to that data and who shouldn't. And then to make sure the CFO is doing his or her job, they might have an access attestation or certification process around it, which every year they would have to review and make sure that they're doing their job and there hasn't been somebody slipped in that shouldn't have access. And so that's the type of control that will directly sustain your compliance efforts. All right, now I mentioned we had a question. I'll go ahead and take that question. Businesses don't have to comply with regulatory compliance, and so therefore they don't need IGA. I kind of paraphrase that a little bit. That's not true necessarily. Just because you're a privately held company doesn't mean that IGA doesn't work for you. Let me give you an example. That same process that I mentioned for the publicly held company, where the CFO controls and then periodically reviews who has access to critical financial data, it might be the secret blueprints for a privately held company that are in the same situation. The head of engineering only allows people who should have or have a need to see that intellectual property be in the group that grants access to that design or that secret formula or whatever it is. And if that were to get out, it could damage the business and put them out of business. So in that case, you're not, needing to worry about compliance regulations. This would be more of an internal policy to prevent a loss of the business. And that would be a case where there would be a privately held or non-compliant regulated organization who might need IGA controls. It's just good practices. Okay, so let's talk about some of the top governance policies that everybody should have, and these are the ones we see the most of. There's basically 3 of them that we see every place. And they're typically, well, they can be sort of the first steps to getting a solid IGA plan in place, but they're all 3, I would say not, I wouldn't say they're difficult to implement. There just might be some challenges there, but certainly all 3 of these have really big impacts on the efficiency of your organization from an identity management standpoint. And so these are the 3 that we think are the top governance policies that should be implemented. First is an identity lifecycle policy. We all know people get jobs and they lose jobs or they leave jobs. And there's a lot of things that can happen from the time somebody's hired to the time that they retire, they're fired, or they pass away. It starts with user provisioning. That's the term where you create a user account. And then you might have to create a secondary or third account, or make sure that it's in hybrid's case synced to the cloud and linked to that account properly. You might want to assign resources to them, put them in a group so they can get the company newsletter and give them a mailbox and assign a Microsoft 365 license to them. You might want to allow them to request additional information or allow them to request additional access to resources. People move. They'll go from one city to another. They'll get promoted or demoted. And so the level of access will need to be changed. So the whole time an account is alive, meaning it's been provisioned and now it's active, changes are going to need to be made. And then eventually at some point they'll be separated from the organization. We call that user deprovisioning. And in some cases, especially if you're talking about compliance or legal requirements, the deprovisioning piece is actually the more critical piece, because you want to revoke access in a timely manner. And by doing that, then you prevent non-employees from accessing resources. Usually you don't create an account unless somebody's an employee or a contractor, but when they're done with your organization, you really want to go back to not having them granted any sort of level of access. So a couple of things about an identity lifecycle policy. First of all, the whole process has to be auditable, and you have to prove it, right? You can't just say, oh, it works. You really have to document it, and oftentimes auditors will come in, compliance or security auditors, and they'll say, show me. And so you get to hire some fake employee. They get provision, they get whatever. You show them being promoted, demoted, and then you show what happens when they retire and their access is terminated quickly. That's the ideal scenario, is to show that. It makes documentation for things like SOX audits or HIPAA audits trivial, really simple. And the auditors can say, well, demonstrate it or show me, and you can do that. To really get the best out of the automation, if you have an HR system or an enterprise resource planning system or a student information system, if you're an educational institution, if you can grab data from those systems and feed it to an IGA solution to do the automatic user provisioning and deprovisioning, that's ideal. Because then it's tied to a paycheck oftentimes, so there's a natural check and a balance. Somebody retires, that paycheck's probably gone. No, but seriously, then you have the data that you don't have to double enter and all those types of things. But this process is designed to create a credential, a user account, or identity, and then assign entitlements or resources to that thing in accordance with the standards of your organization. And so again, it really helps you enforce standards. Oftentimes these standards can be in the form of a rule. Those rules can be as simple as, if you're in this department, you should be put into this group so that you get this newsletter. It can be that simple. It can also be much more complex. Maybe has multiple rules based on not just the employee data, maybe the location of the employee, maybe the time of day, etc. If you can automate this process, you're going to take something that costs anywhere from $30 to $50 per employee to provision somebody manually or deprovision them manually, down to maybe less than $1. So there could be a big cost savings. So if you're in an industry that has a higher turnover rate or high seasonal employment rate, automatic provisioning is one of those things can really save you a lot of money. And so we point that out every time because there can be a really good cost benefit and model there. One other thing I'll mention, a lot of people talk about roles when they're talking about employees, and what we have found, especially with this concept, it's called role discovery. It's trying to figure out how you assign resources based on somebody's role within the organization. I don't get too hung up on those. What we find is that when people start that process, they usually end up either having so many roles they're not usable, or they end up with standard full-time employee, temporary employee, vendor, student, staff, faculty. They don't end up with, clerk level 2 and then clerk level 3 and 4 and 5. It's usually just too complex with role-based assignment of these things. So typically users are created and groups are assigned in a Microsoft environment. There's no real concept of a employee role. They do have security roles, but not an employee role. But don't get hung up on those. Those are not things, that you can save for your trillion-dollar identity management platform to do. Those are bigger projects that often cut across departments and are frankly difficult to implement. Entitlements, if you can get those to a point where you have a rule set to figure out, if I put them in group A, they get resource A. If I put them in group B, they get resource B, access to resource B. If you can do all that automatically, those are often enough to kind of get by the majority of things that you need to assign by job. So try and do that as best you can. All right, access lifecycle policy. So we talked about the initial creation of the user account, that's user provisioning. And we talked about, initial provisioning of resources. But one of the challenges that IT has discovered over the past 30 years is that these modern systems, people typically are granted access, but never have that access revoked. And so even though they may have been director when they were hired and now, they're semi-retired, or maybe they went part-time, and as a part-time employee, they're not entitled to the access they had as a manager or an executive, they probably still have that. So the concept of access lifecycle is simple. You have a resource, you identify who needs to make decisions around granting access or revoking access to that resource. There's some kind of process to grant somebody access. Oftentimes it's to the owner of the resource. Sometimes it's as simple as putting together a set of rules that dictate who can access and who can't. But the idea is to create a circle for grants and revocation of access for everything. So the idea being, you grant access, periodically review that access, and make a determination whether it's continued to be appropriate or it should be revoked, and then make the change. And then if it's not revoked, it goes back to the beginning. Every 12 months you review the access or what have you. Or if it's rule-based, as things change for the user account, let's say they move from New York to Pennsylvania, maybe that change of state no longer entitles them to have access to resources that were for people that live in New York State. If you can have a set of rules that automatically understand that and then react to those changes, suddenly you have an IGA policy or an IGA control that is part of the access lifecycle. Because in this case, changes are what we're looking at, whether it's a time-based change, meaning every 12 months we have to check this. And so now that the clock has gone forward and changed, 6 months, we need to do our review. Or if it's a data change, the person's married or divorced or has moved or promoted or demoted, et cetera. All those things can contribute to the data you use as the owner, the person making up the rules to grant or revoke the access. So whatever solution that's chosen for an IGA solution should have some access automation, meaning grants and revocations that are automatic according to rules. And it should have the ability to do manual requests. So as somebody's working, they can request access to some data. When that access request comes through, the owner gets to make the decision, or a rule set is executed to make the decision on their behalf. And then they're either, that requester is either granted or revoked, granted or denied access. And again, we mentioned attestation or certification. These are probably important for sensitive resources to review, have the owner review that access maybe once a year or maybe every 6 months, or once a year or every 4 to 6 months, to make sure that the access has not been granted in error somehow. Some IGA systems will also allow you to have what we call candidate members. Those are people that ahead of time you've already said, yeah, if they're in this department and they're in this location, they can have access. Go ahead and grant it. That's those rules that I mentioned. But I wanted to slip that in there because it allows you to identify a population of identities that haven't been granted access, but who, if they request, they will automatically be granted access. So again, more automation. All right, let's talk about privileged identity policy or privileged identities. So this is more on the administration side, right? This is how do you deal with administrators in my network, people that have the permission to create accounts, delete accounts, grant or revoke access, maybe across all resources, not just their data owner. Maybe they don't actually, they're not the responsible party. They're just somebody who has permission in the system to override everything. Well, in those cases, those privileged identities have to be dealt with because if they are compromised, they become a very dangerous thing to be let loose in the environment. So an privileged identity policy is really designed to enforce a couple of things. It should enforce what we call least privilege delegation, meaning the individual account has the lowest level of permission required to perform whatever tasks it may need to perform. And one thing I'll mention is that most of the time, the native permissions from Microsoft, whether they're on-premise or cloud, they're too much. And you can't break those down far enough to grant individual task level permissions. It's sort of general. If I can reset a password, maybe I can also disable the account. You start to get into those scenarios where it's a kind of a one size fits all permission set. So you may need to turn your attention to a different solution other than native. Again, an IGA solution should allow you to have an administrative interface that enforces least privilege. And also, this will help if you're working towards implementing zero trust. Identity administration is one of those pillars of zero trust. And so that least privilege delegation to administrators, it can also be applied if you're trying to implement a zero trust methodology. Granting and revoking rights over the admin tools, another key thing, could be a part of the same process you had for granting and revoking access to data and applications. Could also be time-based, so they can only create user accounts for 3 hours, or reset a server within a certain time frame. These accounts outside of whatever IGA system, as just a general practice, are very powerful accounts. And so it's not a good idea to have an administrator using that account with all those permissions to do things like read their email or surf the internet, where a virus might be introduced, or a malware might be introduced that could use their own permissions of that privileged account to go off and take over the rest of the environment. So you want to enforce just a physical policy with everybody, or you're going to be fired if you don't follow this policy. I don't know what we call those, mandatory business policy, I guess, that you use 2 separate accounts, one for your administration and one for your day-to-day use. And then finally, self-service group management, even for a data or application owner, that is a privileged operation. And so those accounts should be treated, maybe they don't have full administrative control over everything, but they have administrative access control over critical resources. And so you should treat those as privileged identities and make sure that they're protected as well.
Hey, Bob, we have a question. It's kind of a loaded question, but it might be a good spot to quickly touch on
Okay,
it.
let's take the
Yeah,
loaded
so
question.
perfect. My company is a public company and we are subject to SOX and HIPAA, which requires us to restrict access. What controls does Chaosoft offer that can help in this case?
Oh, yeah. I'm going to mention that we do have a lot of compliance controls that are basically IGA controls that are directly applicable for SOX, HIPAA, PCI, Canadian version of Sarbanes-Oxley. Self-service group management is one that I mentioned earlier. We do offer access certification. And we actually offer access certification and attestation, which is the digital signature on top of that, for two reasons. One is to review the level of access and make sure it's correct. That's probably more for compliance reasons. But we also offer it just to help keep the environment clean. And so one of the certification results could be, do you still need this group? Is this access, this group that's granting access, is the group still needed? Maybe that project's long dead. You don't need the group anymore. Why have it around where it could potentially cause confusion or disruption? So that's one. We do offer, if you are a Microsoft Active Directory, Azure Active Directory hybrid group, we do have hybrid user provisioning, and maybe more importantly, hybrid user deprovisioning. And so out of those 7 or 8 checkboxes, we probably fulfill more than half. On that slide, we had a couple back with the 7 different examples, plus a lot more. We probably don't have time to really get into here. But by the way, the reason that I almost failed to mention this, we do have to this presentation a companion live demonstration of our solution and how we meet IGA requirements with our software as that set of compliance controls or IGA controls. And so at the end of this, we'll talk about how you can get access to it. It will also be available later on if you aren't able to make the dates that we have currently set. By joining this webinar, you'll automatically be invited to those. So keep an eye on your invite list. Good question. Thank you for that. Appreciate it. Gave me an opportunity to talk about Chaosoft. Kind of cool. All right, so let's talk about this ITDR thing. I almost skipped that too quickly. So what is ITDR? Well, Gartner Consulting, Gartner Group, maybe they're better known as, identified a newer set of software solutions out there that are designed not to look at changes that indicate you've been compromised, but look at mistakes in configuration or areas of the identity systems that need help. What does that mean? Well, the idea is to look at the systems as they sit, not as they're being changed, but as they were installed and currently configured, and look for things that would open up a possible attack path. So these are misconfigurations that leave the door open to having something bad happen. It could also be that something bad has already happened because you left one of those doors open and you'd like to know that that's happening. And most of the time, there's some indication that an attack has already had. So that's ITDR, Identity Threat Detection and Response. This is different from network threat detection. We're not looking at your routers. We're not, looking for traffic. This is looking at your identity system. In this case, Active Directory and Azure Active Directory for these issues that are threats to the availability of that service. So identity resilience policy, I wouldn't say this is an IGA policy necessarily. It could very well be another policy, but we really classify this as a threat detection and response policy. You want to ensure that the identities are not disrupted. As we saw in slide number 3, I think it was, all those administrators and identity directory owners all said number one fear they had is if Active Directory goes down, the organization stops working, right? It ceases to exist, basically. So you want to make sure you don't have that happen. So the idea behind an identity resilience policy is to make sure that those identities and the access they're granting on a day-to-day basis are not disrupted by identifying things that might disrupt them in the future. Or if they are disrupted, because there's that old saying, security folks in IT have to be right every day, and an attacker only has to be right once on one day. That's a tall order, and so it will happen that you get attacked. And if that's the case, and they hit you with ransomware, you're going to need some way to recover from that. That's in a resilience policy, it discusses looking for the threats, how to mitigate them, and then also when they do get through, if they get through, how to recover that. These resilience policies also should look for just changes that are inappropriate. And that's how most insider threats are actually done. So, you can look for user behavior. Somebody reset their password at some weird time. But more likely, it's going to be somebody's password got stolen. They get logged in, under false pretenses, and then they figure out how to use that to add themselves to a group or to, read administrative passwords off of the workstation they compromised or whatever it might be. But oftentimes the directory data itself will reflect those things, or it could just be somebody looking to disrupt operations. So look for mistakes or malicious changes in the data of the identities themselves, or in the controls themselves. And when you monitor for those types of changes, you see them, you definitely want to have a way of rolling those back. And you want to definitely monitor privileged accounts. They're not the only way people compromise environments, but they're one of the top targets. And so, keep an eye on what's going on with your 5 Active Directory administrators or your 12 help desk accounts, because those are the high value targets that somebody looking to disrupt your business operations to, hold you for ransom or to stop your business as for competitive reasons or whatever it might be, they're going to use. So continuing on a little bit, identity threat detection and response itself, it goes beyond log collection or SIEM tools. SIEM tools really only look at event logs and what's in them. If something was just misconfigured to begin with, there's nothing in an event log. Event logs are created when some change is made. And so ITDR goes beyond SIEMs because it identifies misconfigurations or other vulnerabilities, maybe a patch is missing or something that you need to address. It's not just looking at changes where a SIEM tool would only be looking for changes. ITDR systems typically monitor the identity system, looking for attack paths that have been found. There are hundreds and hundreds of compromises out there. You're going to hear the term golden ticket. There's all sorts of embedded threats that can be created very easily. There's an admin SD holder object in Active Directory that sets permissions everywhere. If somebody gets a hold of that and can set their own permissions, they basically get permissions everywhere. There's rogue domain controllers. I mean, just the list goes on and on. And so ITDR systems are built to take, what's known and check your systems to see if you fall within that or if it's already been mitigated. And it doesn't just look for, these holes that exist or these threats or risks. They also can be used to look for indications that they've already been exploited, like the rogue domain controller that often leaves an object reference in the directory that can be looked for. And if you find that particular artifact in the directory, it indicates that you've been attacked that way. And so now it's up to you to figure that out. But one of the key things here is that because this stuff is continuous and these exploits are coming fast and furious, you should look for an identity threat detection system that acts to quickly incorporate those new threats. So something that acts more like an antivirus for your identity where it's constantly being updated with potentially new threats as quickly as possible, so that you don't have to take the chance that you're 8 months old and the data you're scanning with is not up to date and there's some threat that was discovered since the last time you installed the product that is left unresolved. ITDR systems also help drive and define your response to the threats that it's finding before they become problems. So the ultimate goal is to stop things before they're an issue. But again, the last piece there is response. It may be that you have to prepare for the best and plan for the worst, right? So you may get compromised and you need a process and definitely some preparation to recover from those things. So if I have to compare these on one slide, which we did, sort of on the top right, you'll see IGA. That's the topic of our conversation today. And you'll see all those items that we had as examples. And then threat detection, it actually has a lot of moving parts to it. But you want to be careful there because not all ITDR solutions are the same. And there are some that have, unfortunately, a good chance of failure, especially on the recovery side, on the response side. But this gives you an indication of sort of what pieces fall where. It's all about threats and recovery on the ITDR side. It's all around implementing standards and preparing and preventing on the IGA side. So hopefully this gives you kind of an idea or understanding of where these pieces all sort of fall together. I don't believe you could have a modern IT environment without having both of these. Just to let you know, I think the security of your identity and access systems depend on both. Security and resilience, I should say. So the ability to withstand a strike or a hit or an attack and recover from that and continue on. All right, so just a quick word from our sponsor. This is us. This is Chaosoft. We actually operate in 3 areas: management, monitoring, and recovery. And above that, you'll see translated sort of into today's conversation. Management is all about identity administration. Monitoring and some of the administration some of the management is around identity governance. Those are the rules. And then identity resilience. We do have a Active Directory, forest, and data recovery solution as part of our series of products. Again, I'm going to mention the live demos that we provide. If you're interested in any of these, that's probably the best bet. We'll give you a link here for a moment. So next on your list of must-sees is a live demo unifying hybrid Active Directory and Office 365 around our governance solutions, IGA solutions. And then we have another webinar that we recommend after that is dedicated to just talking about user provisioning for hybrid Active Directory and Office 365 environments, both of which are very good sessions. Lots of good information. The live demos are product specific and Chaosoft specific, just sort of get that. The webinars, while we do mention what we do and we talk about our company, we're very proud of what we've accomplished here at Chaosoft. They're more around just giving you the general information and the details you're going to need when considering, how, is user provisioning for us? Do we want to automate that process or do we want to semi-automate the process? And with this, I'm going to turn it back over to Justin to close us up.
Thanks, Bob. Thank you all for your time. We do hope you enjoyed this event. At this time, we'll take attendance for the gift card drawing, and we will email that winner directly. So you'll see here on the screen a few links for the Chaosoft website. Should you have any additional questions, you can visit chaosoft.com/question. If you'd like to schedule a personalized demo or get a free trial, you see these links here as well. We also have a QR code on the screen here that you can scan with your phone, and that will take you directly to the demo request page. Fill out that form and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. And of course, for more information about Chaosoft and our solutions, feel free to visit us at chaosoft.com. So with that, I want to thank Bob for speaking today and thank you all for taking the time to join us. We hope you have a great day.